This episode of the Renewable Energy Smart Pod is brought to you by Deloitte. The way we power the world is changing, and Deloitte is helping leaders amplify innovation, inspire change, and illuminate a cleaner, brighter future of energy. Explore how Deloitte can help your company create a more sustainable net zero future. To learn more, click on the Deloitte links in the show notes. What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Renewable Energy Smart Pod. I'm your host, Sean McMahon, and there's no denying the topic of today's episode is indeed a very hot topic. There's been a lot of buzz about the role hydrogen stands to play in the energy transition. To help separate the signal from the noise, the law firm of Vinson Elkins just released a paper that outlines the current low-carbon hydrogen landscape and what lies ahead as factors like the Inflation Reduction Act continue to drive growth in the sector. My guest today is Alan Alexander, a partner at V&E. Alan is going to walk us through the themes of the paper and share his thoughts on how the hydrogen sector is maturing. I got to tell you, the paper is an excellent primer on hydrogen. But what I also like about it is it includes an insightful summary of key points that developers and financiers need to remember when planning and negotiating hydrogen projects. So not only is that paper from Vinson Elkins hot off the presses, but the Department of Energy also just released the first ever National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap for the United States. The roadmap lays out a comprehensive framework for accelerating the production, processing, delivery, storage, and use of clean hydrogen. Much of what the DOE roadmap outlines dovetails perfectly with the Vinson Elkins paper. But just in case you listened to my conversation with Alan and wonder why we don't go into detail about the roadmap, well, that's because the roadmap was released by the DOE just as we were finishing the recording of our interview. What can I say? It's a timely topic. So whether it's coming from DOE or V&E, there's a lot of hydrogen news out there right now. Hopefully this episode will provide you with a greater understanding of what it all means. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My guest is Alan Alexander, a partner at Vinson Elkins. Alan, how you doing today?
Sean, I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you on here. We're here to talk about a paper that Vinson Elkins just released. It's called Unlocking the Opportunity of Low-Carbon Hydrogen, Investment, Incentives, and Collaboration. So let's give our readers just a quick background on this. So what's the quick synopsis on the various ways that hydrogen is produced?
There are a number of ways hydrogen is produced, and there's this interesting little color scheme that, has proliferated and widely discussed, and largely to help people talk about the ways hydrogen is produced. I find the color scheme in a number of respects to be confusing and misleading, but I don't think it's going to get dislodged anytime soon. I think some of the ones that are most talked about would be gray hydrogen produced the traditional way from steam methane reformers. People talk about green hydrogen, which traditionally kind of means hydrogen made in electrolyzers that are powered by renewable sources of energy, wind, solar, what have you. A lot of people like to talk about pink hydrogen, which is also hydrogen produced in electrolyzers, but the power source is nuclear fission technology, nuclear fission plants. There are companies out there trying to develop and prove technology that produces hydrogen using what's called methane pyrolysis, which essentially superheats natural gas and separates the natural gas into hydrogen and the carbon is then emitted in a solid form as opposed to a gas. And there's blue hydrogen. A lot of people talk about that, which is essentially hydrogen produced the same way gray hydrogen is produced, but with carbon capture and sequestration technology added on. And there's a lot of other colors I've heard: yellow, gold, red, purple. I don't even know what a lot of them are. But I would say the ones that get talked about quite a bit in current discussions about hydrogen are, of course, gray, blue, green, and to a little bit lesser extent, turquoise and pink.
Okay, yeah. Speaking of pink, so pink is produced using nuclear, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
I saw a deal that was kind of stop and go phase from Constellation. It's kind of in the headlines this week, and whether they're going to make that happen. But getting back to the report, so what's the current mix of production percentages? Of all the hydrogen that's created by all these various processes, what are some of the most popular, I guess, or most commonly used?
So Even today, most of the hydrogen in the US and the world is produced via the traditional routes. And I believe that's steam methane reformation. So it would be gray hydrogen is by far and away the most prevalent in the US right now. And you got to bear in mind, until about a year ago when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, a lot of these forms of producing hydrogen, be it with carbon capture technology or via electrolysis, were very interesting, but they weren't cost competitive. And, we'd occasionally get a developer, who'd come in and want to explore the possibilities of doing a low carbon hydrogen project, but it just wasn't, they couldn't find an off taker or someone to purchase it or something to do with it because it just wasn't cost competitive to develop and produce. The Inflation Reduction Act has helped with that to a very large extent. And I believe it is going to be, a factor going forward, over the next 5, 10, 15 years in helping us figure out ways to produce hydrogen in low carbon means and then doing something with that hydrogen. So the mix is going to diversify. But really, until a year ago, the U.S. didn't have a regulatory infrastructure in place to really make it happen. And so as a result, and some of these, as we're going to talk about, are very long lead time projects to develop. So we're still looking at a mix in the U.S. that I guess is 95% or higher of traditional gray hydrogen.
Okay. And now the paper also does an excellent job of kind of outlining the various use cases for hydrogen. So take our listeners through that. What are some of the most common use cases?
So what a lot of people are talking about with hydrogen are not kind of the traditional ways it's used. The traditional ways it's used are, in refining processes, in petrochemical production. There certainly is some of that. We're seeing a lot of developers who want to develop, low carbon ammonia plants, for example, and that involves producing low carbon hydrogen. But some of the really exciting uses for hydrogen and some of the things not only are people talking about, but that we're beginning to see people attempt to develop are hydrogen as a mobility solution. You can right now buy a hydrogen powered car if you want to, but there is a bit of a lack of a fueling infrastructure in the United States. There's companies like Nikola who are trying to develop large trucks. There's hydrogen bus fleets. And there's initiatives, and there are developers trying to figure out how to develop a hydrogen refueling network. That's one very exciting prospect for it. A number of people are looking at essentially using hydrogen as a form of energy storage. So, rather than taking wind or solar, that might not be able to be used at the time it's produced, and essentially lost, you could use it to power electrolyzers, produce hydrogen. If you could store that hydrogen somewhere, possibly underground or somewhere else, and then release it and combust it, at a time when the grid needs power, then you're essentially finding a way to do, large storage projects of renewable power. A number of companies are now looking at experimenting with and implementing projects to use hydrogen as a reduction agent in the production of steel. Normally, the reduction agent was just, you'd have molten iron and you'd put carbon in it to essentially take out, some of the sticky carbon molecules, but it would emit a lot of carbon in the process. But if you can use hydrogen as that reduction agent, it lowers, the carbon footprint associated with producing steel. And so a lot of people are investigating that. And it's a very exciting prospect. A lot of what we're seeing right now also are what we call power to fuels projects. And they're very exciting. And I think one of the challenges hydrogen faces is that the transportation and handling and storage and distribution network for it essentially doesn't exist. And for a number of reasons, it's a difficult molecule to store and handle. But if you can take renewable power, use it to make hydrogen, and then use that hydrogen to essentially fabricate natural gas, and from there possibly make naphtha, diesel, sustainable aviation fuel with it, then you have instantly a transportation network that already exists in the United States to handle and transport a lot of these fuels. So the power to fuel space is a place where we're seeing, a lot of clients, a lot of developers, really gain some traction. It's a very exciting space as well. It overcomes a lot of problems that hydrogen faces. Final one is kind of near and dear to me is basically using hydrogen to make low carbon ammonia. Ammonia is kind of a base chemical and building block for a lot of other things, fertilizers, explosives, and what have you. Of course, in and of itself, it could also be part of the energy transition mix. There are companies looking at using ammonia as a power generation fuel itself. And if you can produce that ammonia in a low carbon manner, better for everyone. So anyway, there's a lot of uses being explored. I would say ammonia and power to fuels are the places where we've seen kind of the most traction so far. maybe storage a little bit less and mobility a little bit less, but they're beginning to catch on. So
I really appreciate that breakdown. I mean, you definitely touched on a couple of topics we've covered on this show, hydrogen hubs and the storage for that way, and then also sustainable aviation fuel and things like that. But you also did mention the handling of hydrogen. And obviously, that's a concern for a lot of people. What are some of the concerns there, and how are those concerns being addressed?
Well, with any combustible material, people are going to be worried about safety. Fortunately, in the United States and Europe, I think we're very good at transporting combustible materials under pressure in a way that's safe. And hydrogen would certainly fit into being a combustible material. There's not an extensive distribution network for hydrogen. There's one in and along the Gulf Coast of the United States to supply refineries and petrochemical facilities. Those companies, the industrial gas companies, operate with a very good safety record. Of course, if we're going to do it larger in its scale, we're going to need to develop ways to basically handle, store, and transport hydrogen safely. But I'm confident that we've got the expertise to do that because we've been doing it with a lot of other flammable and combustible materials for years. Now, hydrogen is unique. It's a small molecule. It can seep out of cracks that other things can't. Everyone at some point in their life has also seen the black and white video of the Hindenburg exploding, which probably conjures up a negative association. But
yeah, that's just to jump in there real quick. Yeah, that's definitely one of the things people think about a lot, and also just in terms of the infrastructure for it. I mean, I've talked to folks in the energy trading landscape, and they're kind of they're somewhat skeptical, like whether it's going to get built out safely. So, but you're confident that can happen.
Well, I think your friends and your trading friends are onto something. And I think it's a point, maybe we didn't mention explicitly enough in our paper, but that I state a lot. I don't know that we are going to build out an extensive nationwide hydrogen transportation, storage, and handling infrastructure similar to, like, for example, what we have for natural gas. But we may not need to. A lot of the things that we're seeing get some traction, like power to fuels, for example, just get around that problem. You produce the hydrogen, you turn it into natural gas, methane, and then essentially it's natural gas. You put it in that existing transportation network. Or, the way hydrogen lots of times is used now, it's basically produced on site or, within close proximity to its final end use destination or its final end use. So, unlike a fossil resource like natural gas or oil, where it just comes out of the ground wherever geology and God decided to put it, hydrogen production, you can, it is produced. You can decide where you're going to produce it. You can produce it closer to your end use infrastructure if you need to. And so a lot of the projects we see actually getting traction, kind of inherently understand that and just site their hydrogen production close to where it's actually going to be used to the extent possible. So that, is more possible in in what you would call the blue or maybe the turquoise hydrogen production methodologies. Some of the things like electrolysis that require large amounts of renewable power. Renewable power is going to be produced in West Texas or Arizona. You somehow need to either produce the hydrogen there and transport it, or get the renewable power into where you're producing the hydrogen. But transporting, electrons, subject to grid capacity and constraints, is, also already exist. So.
Okay, and you mentioned electrolysis, and we can't talk about electrolysis without talking about electrolyzers. And, with all these new projects coming online, whether it's renewables or any other sources, it seems to me there's going to be a worldwide demand for electrolyzers.
Yes.
What does that supply chain look like? And is there any kind of concern where there might not be enough of those to go around?
Sean, that's a really good question. I have been trying to bottom out the answer to that one for a while. And I wish I could give you a definitive answer, but I've read reports that indicate, production capacity is ramping up. And as projects, begin to take FID, the capacity will be there. I've read reports that indicate there's going to be a huge capacity constraint on electrolyzer production because the amount of projects that are getting announced and the amount of electrolyzers that are going to be needed are going to far outstrip, production capacity before it comes online. I've read other reports that indicate it's actually even worse than that because a lot of the different electrolyzer technologies use rare earth minerals that are produced in places that might be under sanctions right now, such as Russia. So I think it's murky. And, I'm not exactly sure whether we're going to be facing a supply chain constraint as it comes to, electrolyzer production capacity or not, and it's definitely something I think project developers need to be aware of and maybe need to contemplate, finding an electrolyzer supplier earlier in their procurement process as opposed to later, just to be on the safe side. But at least for now, it's not entirely clear to me what that supply chain picture looks like.
We'll be right back. Building a brighter tomorrow starts with illuminating greater possibilities today. That's why Deloitte helps organizations weave sustainability into their business decisions. Join Deloitte in creating a brighter, cleaner tomorrow. To discover what's sustainable, renewable, and possible in the future of energy, click on the Deloitte links in the show notes. And hey, while we're talking about Deloitte, if you want to hear directly from one of their experts, check out the most recent episode of the Sustainability Smart Pod. During that episode, I chatted with John Mennel, a managing director in Deloitte's Sustainability, Climate, and Equity practice. John walked me through some awesome tools that Deloitte has to help companies plan and execute on their decarbonization strategies. I learned a lot, so I'm going to include a link in the show notes of this episode so you can give it a listen. And now back to my conversation with Alan Alexander from Vinson Elkins. At the top of this interview, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and how that's, anticipated to create quite a boost for this sector. And so walk us through the specific points of that and just how big of an impact things like tax credits and other incentives might have for the hydrogen production industry.
They're an absolute game changer. And, Sean, as I mentioned earlier, a year and a half ago, when we would talk about low carbon hydrogen projects, they never really went anywhere. They very quickly, at least in the United States, ran into, economic realities. And those economic realities were it cost about $6 per kilogram to produce a kilogram of green, if you will, hydrogen, with renewable power through an electrolyzer. Cost around $1 to $1.50 to produce that same kilogram in steam methane reformer. So it was just not cost competitive. At a potential $3 per kilogram production tax credit, that math changes pretty quickly. You get a lot closer to parity. And then depending on how your project is structured, the renewable power generation could qualify for investment tax credits or production tax credits. If you have standalone storage, there might be a credit associated with that. If you're doing a power to fuels project, there could potentially be the availability of a 45Z credit for advanced biofuels, although you begin to run into anti-stacking provisions. And of course, the projects that are utilizing carbon capture could qualify for 45Q. Some of those projects can do things to potentially, depending on what Treasury may or may not allow, but get the carbon intensity of their hydrogen low enough, you could have what would nominally be a blue hydrogen production project that could qualify for a production tax credit. We've seen some developers try to explore that route as well by doing things like supplying some of their natural gas with renewable natural gas from agricultural sectors in the Midwest, for example. So it's really exciting, and it's got a lot of people, it took these projects that were on the whiteboard, but, never even made it off the whiteboard into term sheets, and it's really got some things now that are in term sheets that have parties throwing real resources and developing them. There's capital being raised to support some of these things. You have the financial sector that's really looking at ways to make them work and make them bankable. So, the Inflation Reduction Act was an absolute game changer as it relates to hydrogen. It has made it viable in the United States.
I was going to ask you about tax credits, and what's being talked about a lot is stacking up the different tax credits, right? But you just mentioned something in there about anti-stacking measures. So what is that all about?
Well, as it relates to hydrogen, if you are producing hydrogen in what would be referred to as blue, which is utilizing carbon capture technology, and you take a 45Q credit for the permanent sequestration of carbon oxides, then that facility, there's a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act that says no taxpayer who has taken a tax credit from a facility, as a result under Section 45Q, basically for the capture and permanent sequestration of carbon oxides, they can't then change their mind later and take 45V. They have to take one or the other. And if they've ever taken 45Q, they can never take 45V. And so you essentially can't stack those two credits. You got to choose one or the other. And then, kind of depending on what you're doing, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, had a ton of credits available to it. Some of them, taxpayers and facilities aren't allowed to take multiple credits. So, for example, I believe 45Z, I'd want to confirm with my tax colleagues, you can't take that if you're taking 45V. So it really forces you to kind of look at your project, figure out which tax credit is the most powerful for what you're trying to do, and optimize around it.
Now, the paper also talks about some of the hydrogen hubs that are part of the policy here in the U.S. And just explain those real quick. Like I said, we've had a couple episodes about those, but What are the insights from this paper as it relates to hydrogen hubs?
Yeah, what I like about the hydrogen hubs, and one of the things we talk about in the paper, whereas the Inflation Reduction Act was largely a supply side impetus mechanism, it's encouraging people to produce these things in the United States and using the tax code as a method to do that. What the hydrogen hubs are trying to do is, stimulate and develop demand. So I really like the hydrogen hub program because it's the government, putting $8-10 billion to work to say, okay, industry, give us some unique ideas as to how to use hydrogen. Show us who you're going to partner with, show us what you're going to do, show us how it's going to be used, what it's going to solve. And you know what? If we like your idea, we are going to give you $800 million, $1 billion to go out and get this done. And I know the old saying, whenever the government's offering you something for free, reach for your wallet, but it really is a grant. Of course, there are a few strings attached. There's a requirement to use some of the funds in community development initiatives and other things and things of that nature. But for the most part, it is give us a good idea. And if we select you, we'll give you money to help make that happen. So it's government putting, taxpayer dollars to work in a way to try to develop hydrogen demand across the country. And I've been involved with some clients on, some of the hub applications. It's really kind of interesting and innovative, some of the things that our people are thinking about doing to, stimulate hydrogen demand and use in the United States. So I think looking forward to seeing the winners of the hub program hopefully later this year, and then we can hopefully see how that begins to develop out a hydrogen infrastructure in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as keen as you are to see who kind of comes out of those, secures those projects. But stepping back from the U.S. a little bit, your paper talks about some of the things going on in the EU with the temporal and geographic requirements that firms are going to have to be aware of and perhaps abide by. So what are those?
Yeah. So at a 50,000 foot level, as I just mentioned, what the Inflation Reduction Act has done is stimulate supply. Hydrogen hubs are trying to stimulate demand, but a lot of what the EU has done, to kind of regulate and require the use of low carbon fuels, or at least some degree of low carbon fuels, are essentially demand side stimuli. So what we're seeing, are a lot of people wanting to develop projects in the U.S. to produce hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels that will then be sold in Europe or Asia or somewhere else, where getting the supply side support here to comply with demand side requirements there. And some of the things the EU has said in the recently promulgated delegated acts and others are that okay, that's great, but if you want to get in basically a renewable fuel from a non-biogenic source into the EU, here are some of the requirements. And some of the requirements are it will only qualify if, I forget the percentage, but over an X percentage of the electricity in the region where the hydrogen project was located came from renewable fuels or nuclear, from a low carbon source. The other things are saying if you're using renewables, then over time, you have to be sure that, the renewables you're using, were produced at a time when your hydrogen electrolyzer was functioning, a concept called matching. And the issue with matching is, what is the temporal requirement to it? Is it annual matching? So just as long as there was renewable power produced during the year, you can match it up with your, hydrogen production in that year. Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Is it hourly in some cases? And so the matching requirements with respect to when the electrical power was produced that was used to power your electrolyzer could be a bit of a constraint. And you're going to have to monitor like the power that powered your electrolyzer within, the hour, when was it produced? Those matching requirements, I believe, ramp up over time. They're not required initially, but it is something that the EU has said we're going to require. The other one is the concept of additionality. The EU does require over time, it phases in additionality requirements so that if you're going to produce hydrogen with electrolyzers using renewable power, you have to have added renewable power capacity to the grid. Otherwise, the logic being, what you're doing is you're just taking renewable power from someone who would have used it anyway to power your electrolyzer, and that person who would have bought the existing renewable capacity is essentially buying non-renewable power. So the net effect is nil. So additionality requires new renewable capacity to power, the new renewable demand. And like I said, these are delegated acts. I'm no European legal expert. From what I understand, the commission will approve them, modify them, implement them later. What they say now may not be how they're ultimately approved and implemented, but it does give us some insight as to what the EU is thinking. What it's telling developers is that's great if you want to go to the US and develop a hydrogen project, but if you want to get your fuel into the EU, here's the requirements you're going to have to comply with.
Okay. And so moving on to like the next section of the paper here. So I'm just thumbing through it. Obviously, I'm not a project developer, but there are some great insights there for project developers, kind of advice on things to consider, things to remember as you're, working on putting something together. What are some of the key takeaways there?
There's a number of things. This is one of the things that's really exciting, at least for a lawyer, is, nothing we do in developing a transaction is rarely, anyway, new and something we've never actually done before. Everything we do is, even the new stuff is a little bit derivative. And what we're doing is essentially producing, selling, and delivering a commodity of sorts, or using it to produce a commodity that then gets further sold. But all of a sudden, we're doing it in a way where what we really, really care about, or one of the things we really, really care about, is the carbon intensity or the carbon footprint of this fuel we're producing. And so one of the things that have cropped up in documents when we're beginning to negotiate kind of low carbon hydrogen projects and low carbon fuel projects are, how do you actually certify that the carbon intensity of the product as it's being produced? Because IRA does it one way, the California Air Resources Board does it another. There's all sorts of different ways to calculate carbon intensity, and you're going to get differing results depending on which method you use. Some companies have their own way of doing it. There's third parties who will come in and kind of figure it out for you. But at the end of the day, you need to settle on a way to actually calculate the carbon intensity, and then you need to determine what that means. Normally when a product commodity doesn't satisfy a specification, it's considered off spec and either return it or get a refund or something. Well, here what you have is a product that might otherwise be completely usable, except if it didn't satisfy the carbon intensity requirement, it's not as carbon intense as we were hoping it would be, but it's otherwise completely usable for the purpose it was produced. Well, what does that mean? Because beforehand, if it didn't meet a spec, it wasn't usable. Now it's usable. It just doesn't have the attribute we wanted it to have. Those attributes are also a key source of value. You might produce a low carbon fuel, but who gets the right to claim the carbon accounting benefit for it? Should it be the producer, or does the customer want the carbon accounting benefit? And how much is that benefit, the ability to claim actually the carbon reduction, how much is that worth? Every time you buy an airline ticket now, you see the amount of carbon associated with your flight. Well, there's people who want to be able to account for that carbon. Carbon accounting is becoming a big thing. And as we know in accounting, you can't double book. One person takes the carbon reduction and one person won't. There's other attributes associated with these things sometimes. The ability to generate a biocurrency. In biogenic fuels, what we had were things like RINs and LCFS credits. Well, if something similar develops for non-biogenic fuels, who has the right to claim those? And so there's this whole basket, this whole bundle of sticks, if you will, of value that a lot of these products bring with them that people need to be cognizant of and be sure they don't give away in negotiations. Another thing that's very difficult with hydrogen and low carbon fuels is the pricing element of it. It's what's called the green premium. How much more do you pay for something just because it's low carbon? With traditional commodities, normally you can just look at an index and say, well, there's the price. But there's not a whole lot of indices that have developed yet to let you say how much a low carbon commodity should be. Sometimes the indices are the starting point, But we don't want the indice being what our, low carbon fuel is worth because it's a value additive product. It should be more than whatever the indice is, but how much and how do you calculate it? So a lot of these are some of the kind of in the weeds issues we're seeing popping up. Change in law is always an issue in negotiating a contract, even more so when what's underpinning a lot of the value or governmental programs or tax incentives. I would say kind of the big takeaway, though, and the big thing, I counsel clients on early on is to define what their project is. Seems pretty elementary, but if you're just doing hydrogen, well, you also need renewable power. And if you're doing hydrogen, what are you doing with it? Is someone then taking it to turn it into a fuel? And very quickly, you begin to see that you have a lot of what we call project on project risk. What happens if my hydrogen project is ready to go, but the renewable power facility hasn't been built yet? How do you address those issues? And what happens if I get my hydrogen facility built, but the methanation unit that's going to turn it into natural gas isn't ready yet? And sometimes that's easy if it's one developer doing everything. Even then it's complicated, but it becomes a lot more complicated if you have third parties doing these disparate parts, because you got to make sure unrelated entities are timing up their construction and operations to sync up with each other. So it's really important, I think, to early on define what you're doing, identify your partners, make sure, you're synchronizing your project work together, minimizing project on project risk to the extent possible, so that, when things come online, they come online seamlessly and synchronously.
So you mentioned kind of the dangers of having third party construction and, the timing not being all synced up. Do you see more projects being like that, where maybe one entity is going to own the whole thing and be able to have a little more control over those schedules? Or will it be more common to have, okay, they're building the renewable source or they're building this source and we're all kind of trying to sync up the timing?
I think it's going to be in a lot of these 2, at least 3 people. Renewable power development is a very robust and developed sector in the U.S., actually everywhere. And the people who know how to do that and do it well are known and defined and are very good at it. We need to let them do that. That's what they're good at. They can probably do it cheaper than everyone else. There aren't a whole lot of people out there, maybe anybody, who knows how to develop large-scale hydrogen production projects with electrolyzers. That's what people need to learn. And adjacent to that is, methanation and gas to liquids. But what I see developing are, is renewable power development kind of continuing to just be renewable power development. But that's where a third party basically gets retained by a hydrogen project to say, develop me this 500 megawatt renewable power facility. I will purchase all the output from it, and then we'll use that to power my hydrogen facility. And the people who know how to do that renewable development can do it and can do it well. The people who will finance it, are kind of not the same people who may finance hydrogen electrolyzers and methanation and petrochemical projects. The tax equity market of the world is, relatively established. They know what they're doing. They know how to look at a renewables project and come in and finance it. And what we've heard is a lot of them aren't too interested in some of these new technologies yet. They'd rather just stay in their lane and stick with what they know, which means what you could end up having is the renewable power basically gets done by the people who know how to do it, financed by the people who are comfortable with it, while the new stuff, the hydrogen and the methanation, the gas to liquids, everything else, is it, private equity? Is it commercial banks? A combination of both. Maybe one of the big tax equity players decides to get into it. Direct pay and transferability of the credits also opens up other people who might want to come in and finance the tax credit portion of this. That's kind of an emerging area, TBD, what it'll look like. So there's a lot more questions on the hydrogen and the methanation side than there are on the renewable power side. I think some of the more viable ones and the ones we're seeing come in, at least for now, are someone's doing the renewables, someone else is doing the hydrogen, and what do you do with the hydrogen? And they kind of partner up.
Okay. Now, when I thumb through this paper and I kind of get a sense for what you're trying to do here, it seems like it's an excellent survey of what the hydrogen landscape looks like right now. So what is the one key takeaway you're trying to convey with this paper?
Yeah. The one key takeaway is hydrogen's real. It's viable now in the United States. Inflation Reduction Act has had a big part of that. developers need to be cognizant of how hydrogen can be used. What are some of the stronger use cases for it as opposed to others? And, what are some of the issues we've seen developers have to grapple with so far? So we start with a very broad overview. This is hydrogen. This is all the ways it's being produced. We talk about some of the use cases. And then we kind of want people to focus on what we've seen be important in developing a hydrogen project so far, so that they're cognizant of these areas and they're ready for them when they appear. And, if they have any questions about how to address them or anything, we're certainly here and be happy to talk to them about it. But it's just that, we're excited about hydrogen. We know it's got a future. Here's some of the things we've seen. Let us know if we can help you.
Well, hey, listen, Alan, this has been wonderful. I'm going to encourage everyone to download this paper and read it. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. I really appreciate your insights.
Sean, thank you very much for having me on. Really enjoy talking about this. I'm spending a lot of time on it these days. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential here. I think hydrogen is going to be a part of the energy transition in the States. It's exciting to see just how far it's come in barely a year. And, it's exciting to think about where it's going to be in another year or 2 or 3. And I can't wait to see, how it unfolds and kind of what the hydrogen economy looks like 2 or 3 years from now.
Well, hey, I'm as excited as you are. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sean.
Well, that's our show for today. But before we get out of here, I want to say one final thank you to the sponsor of today's episode, Deloitte.